Welcome back, Buccaneers fans, to another episode of Hear the Cannons presented by BucsGameday, your one and only source for Buccaneers content through Sports
Woo!
Illustrated. Lots to talk about, lots going on. My name is Caleb. You can follow me on Twitter, X, if you will, at CHS Noel, writer reporter here at BucsGameday, along with my friend and lead editor at BucsGameday.com. River Wells at River H Wells on X as well.
That is me,
Yeah, lots to talk about. We've got a lot coming up. We've
for
got the
sure.
new year starting next year with free agency, NFL draft coming up in April. Now that the scouting combine is over as well. While you guys are here, go ahead and click that subscribe button if you're on YouTube. We really appreciate that. Like the video as well as we're going through all this information as we talk about a bunch of offseason moves that are potentially going to happen here in Tampa Bay. Head over to BucsGameday.com. We've got tons of content going out, whether it's predictions that are going on, possibilities for the Buccaneers that could make sense, as well as a slew of other things that we're talking about at BucsGameday.com. Head over there. If you're on Facebook, if you're on X, head over to YouTube, subscribe. You'll be notified whenever we go live. It also allows you to comment on here. Those are the comments we bring on. We don't really get the stuff over from X or from Facebook. A lot of the comments that are arising, any of the questions as well, come over from YouTube. So head over there, click subscribe. We're going to be starting to be a little bit more consistent here with this, get back on track to how we were during the season, especially with things starting to get going this next week. Really excited about
Yes, sir.
that. But with that being said, River, a lot of fun stuff to talk about, a lot of things happening throughout the day. But let's go ahead and jump into some offseason moves here. And we'll start on the offensive side of the ball because we know the majority of the Buccaneers brass's focus is going to be on the defensive side of the ball, as well as ours, as well.
For sure.
That's just kind of where things are at. We know that's where the majority of issues were last season. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's start on the offensive side of the ball because the main thing here is going to be at the wide receiver position. Are the Bucs going to be able to retain Chris Godwin? And what is that going to look like? Because there's seemingly going to be a ton of suitors for him if he does hit the open market. I know Jason Light and company want him back in the fold here in the Puny Room Red. Chris and his wife and his family are here. They've been here since he was drafted, and he does want to stay from all signs pointing forward. So looking at that, what happens with Chris, and then we can kind of off of that go forward on whether or not, even if Chris does leave, there is some depth issues there, Sterling Shepard and guys like that hitting free agency. So any guys that potentially stick out to you as well?
Well, you lined up a few nails and you hit them on the head, I think. Chris Godwin's family has been here. Chris Godwin has been here for a long time. And it's a little bit difficult to kind of uproot yourself. Now, once the pay is really good, it's not too difficult. But initially, once you start out and you're thinking about suitors, that's something you got to think about if your kids are here in school, wherever you live, if your family's here. So I think Chris Godwin will take a little bit below the market rate to stay in Tampa Bay. I firmly believe that. I think it's probably going to happen. But the hard thing is, what is the going rate? Because that's going to determine what a little below the going rate is, right? So if the Jaguars or the Commanders or the Patriots offer, like $25 million or whatever, then if slightly below going rate is 24 or 23, the Bucs got to think about that, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
And depends on where Chris Godwin is with his injury. Depends on how they view him almost being 30, along with Mike Evans. But he had a fantastic season last year. He deserves to be rewarded, and so many people in that building love Chris Godwin. We've heard Jason Light talk about how much he loves Chris Godwin and the family, and how he really symbolizes what it means to be a Buccaneer. And I think Chris Godwin loves the Bucs too. So he's done well here. He's been successful. He's got a lot of great teammates around him, and I think he'll want to be back. But money is money. The going rate's the going rate, and Chris Godwin wants to make something, and he deserves it. So I think I'd be surprised if they got this done before free agency. I think he'll probably hit free agency. I think he'll hear some numbers, which is unlike how Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans got extended, right? They got done before free agency. They never really heard those numbers officially. I'm sure they heard some numbers. But I think he'll hit the market. He'll see what other teams are offering, and then the Bucs will go from there. But I expect Chris Godwin to be back. I do.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. We do know he's had the 2 serious injuries. You mentioned he's getting older. He's not the spry, 22-year-old that, was first on the scene, kind of grew into the Chris Godwin we have become to know. And he was on track, as you mentioned, River last year in the Cohen system, to have perhaps the best year the best season of his career.
He was on All-Pro track, absolutely. So that deserves a reward, but who's going to give it to him is the question. And I think it'll be Tampa Bay.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think majority of Buccaneers fans, majority of Bucs, anybody who pays attention to the Bucs thinks that Godwin is likely to end back in Tampa. But if that doesn't happen, what are some names out there potentially on the free agent market? Especially the Buccaneers could obviously look towards the draft, but we know Jalen McMillan is going to be one of the starters. We know Mike is going to be there. If Chris isn't there, I know you wrote a piece about this earlier. I haven't had a chance to check that out yet. So throw out a couple names there for the people listening on potential guys that the Buccaneers could look towards in free agency to come to Tampa.
Yeah, well, I mentioned three. I mentioned one that would be pretty expensive. I mentioned one that would probably be in a mid-range salary, and then I mentioned a really cheap option too. The first one at the top of the expense ladder would be Darius Slayton from the New York Giants. Not as much a producer on paper, but he's had to deal with some dreadful quarterback play over there in New York. Averages around 15 yards per reception basically throughout his whole career almost, and it was almost 15 last year too. So that's a great option. The Bucs need a guy who can stretch the field too. So Trey Palmer was supposed to be that guy. Hasn't worked out that way. So Darius Slayton could end up being that replacement who can do that if Chris Godwin is not available. Next up, we have Tyler Lockett. SpotRack had Darius Slayton at 15.8 million APY, by the way, and Lockett looking at about 7.7 by their metrics. So that'd be a mid-range deal. Lockett's one of the most renowned possession receivers to play in the NFL. In fact, people kind of get
image, if you will,
yeah, people kind of get mad at him for falling early, even. But he's a guy who gets catches. He's a producer. He's reliable. It feels almost sacrilegious to talk about him being in a uniform that's not a Seattle Seahawks uniform, but that's the reality that he faces at his age. So that wouldn't be a bad option, I don't think, if you need to get someone in there quick. And then for my cheap option, SpotRack has this player at 1.9 million APY, De'Ami Brown from the Washington Commanders. Brown has not had a lot of production. He's been sitting behind a few guys in Washington, but he had a really good playoff run. He caught for almost as many yards in the playoffs as he did in the regular season. And he had a touchdown that Buccaneers fans will unfortunately probably remember because it came against them in Raymond James Stadium. Fast guy, separation guy. Mike's the big 50-50 jump ball sort of receiver, big archetype. And there's a lot more of those really shifty space separators out there. And the Bucs could benefit from taking a chance on a guy like that for very little money. And to see maybe how he would play with more snaps in a different offense. So those are three options that struck out with me immediately. But Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, they will be available. Brandon Cooks, who is still in the league and, believe it or not, still producing at a decent clip. He's going to be a free agent.
Same draft class as Mike, wasn't he?
Yeah, and that's something to think about too. And of course, if you're crazy, Devontae Adams is available on the market. But
talk about expensive.
Yeah, and I think he's going to be on the West Coast or play with Aaron Rodgers because I guess he enjoys losing football games. But other than that, those are your options, I think.
Yeah, I think those are all very interesting. I didn't even really have Lockett on my radar, even though like you had mentioned it, we had talked about it before. And it's interesting because he is a lot like Chris in the way he plays. Knows where to sit down in the holes of the defense. And
he's old. He's older, and if you have a problem with age, Lockett's not going to help. But if you need a quick tire plug, there you go. Yeah.
And Darius Slayton and De'Ami Brown kind of about the same, type of player. Obviously, you get more production with Slayton, with
for sure.
De'Ami obviously being buried a little bit there, but he did have that outburst in the playoffs that played very well then. And Darius Slayton, you were mentioning he was putting up 15 point something yards, per catch, and that's with Malik Neighbors. So you think about him coming in to Tampa, Jalen McMillan would move over to that number 2 slot. You plug in Darius Slayton at a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 spot.
He could flourish in that role.
Do pretty well, in my opinion. Shout out Cody Haynes, one of our guys that regularly listens to us, giving us some love over there on YouTube. Appreciate you, Cody. If any of you guys else are watching us, go ahead, hit subscribe over there on YouTube. We really appreciate it. Like us, shoot us some questions as we go throughout the show. Corey Davis, interesting here from Low Country Pirate. Corey Davis is a free agent. He believes, not quite sure.
I think Corey Davis kind of retired. I don't know if he officially turned the paperwork in, but I don't think he's going to be an option.
I mean, then you start looking at guys like if you're looking at a Corey Davis, you're thinking about like a Deontay Johnson, Josh Palmer, that kind
Those are all available, and they'll be cheap. They'll be cheap too. So
cheap, but do you really want to deal with some of that? We know what you kind of get with Josh Palmer, even though he's still young, still has the ability. You could say the same thing with a guy like a Mike Williams, even though he is 30, a little bit older there too. But there's options there. Keenan Allen, also another older guy, but mimics a little bit of what Mike Evans does.
A little bit, yeah.
I like the guys that you threw out there. I think they fit, the system the Buccaneers want to run and would fit well into the system that Josh Grizzard is going to be implementing as well. But enough wide receiver talk because I don't want to dive too deep into the Chris Godwin saga because everybody has hit on it repeatedly over the course of what is happening. While the Levante David talk has been awfully quiet. So speaking of Levante David, let's move over to the defensive side of the ball, but let's go to the edge rushers. We know the Buccaneers didn't pick up the 5th-year option on JTS. Likely to move on from him. For obvious reasons. Didn't quite get what we wanted out of him with the draft pick that we took. Never really materialized, never really developed into the type of player. With that being said, the Buccaneers, even if he were to, kind of produce this past season, still needed help on the edge. It's really an area they struggled, leaving their corners on islands for way longer than it needed to be. And there are a ton of edge rushers that are available. We've got
a lot of guys you can sign and guys you can trade for as well. And we'll see if Jason Light finally pulls the trigger on a big splash trade, perhaps.
Yeah, because those two big guys in the trade market, Myles Garrett, going to cost you a lot. Probably more so than the other guy that was announced today. Cincinnati Bengals giving
Trey Hendrickson,
to go ahead and hit the open market, or not the open market, hit the trade market there, be able to see what his value is, which should be probably pretty high because, as mentioned, but as River had mentioned earlier in one of his pieces over on BucsGameday.com, 17.5 sacks, pretty dang good at. Even what he's about 30 years old as well. So, and then outside of the two trade candidates there, you're looking at guys who are still able to produce. Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Josh Sweat, a very intriguing option there coming from the Eagles. Hassan Reddick, Azeez Ojulari, Chase Young, another young guy. Obviously, we know what fell through with the Washington Commanders and then ending up with the Saints. Later on, also there. And then a guy like a Dante Fowler as well. Any of those guys really spark your interest in? Could you see Jason Light, going for a Trey or a Myles Garrett? I think it's more likely that it would be Trey, but apparently everybody and their mom is in on Trey. Everybody's making phone calls. So who kind of stands out there to you, and what direction do you think Jason Light and the Buccaneers decide to
go? It's tough. I just don't see Jason Light as the big splash trade kind of guy for Henderson. I do agree. Low Country Pirate mentions here Jason likes cheap value. Henderson probably should be the move. Yeah, Jason likes a lot of those low cost, high production sort of trades, which a lot of people, I guess, ideally would have. But sometimes you want to bring in a guy who's completely developed and can just immediately impact your team at day one. Henderson's one of those guys, but we've mentioned there's a lot of holes on defense. There's linebacker, there's safety, there's corner. Do you want to give a really big splash on a guy like Hendrickson? And that might cost like a second, maybe even a low end first. And he's going to want, remember, guys, Max Crosby got re-signed a few days ago. So Hendrickson's up next for extension, and it's probably going to be more than that. That's north of $30 million a year. Yeah, so if you want to do that, if you want to do that,
Josh Capo threw that out there.
Yeah, if you want to do that, that's cool. And it wouldn't be a bad decision inherently, I don't think, because Hendricks is just such a producer, but it's not really a Light's MO. I think, we've heard some buzz about the Bucs liking Khalil Mack. That would be a good fit. Khalil Mack's a little older, but he's only 2 seasons removed from north of 10 sacks, which is just unbelievable to even say. He's a Hall of Famer, so that's how that goes. But that's definitely an option I think they might like, depending on how expensive he is. You don't want to get too expensive with a guy that's that old. And Joey Bosa is the least productive of that little Chargers pair. He doesn't play a lot of football games, which kind of inhibits your ability to win. But he's still been productive in the little isolated pockets he has played football in. Do you want to gamble on a guy like that when the Bucs have gone through defensive injuries like a corner and seeing how that can affect your team? I don't know. But and then you have the draft, man. As Raku, guys like that have been linked with the Bucs quite often.
Which we do know Jason likes to draft edges. So
he does, and they need to do a better job of developing those edges. They've had problems with that, which is why this might be the year they finally just commit and get a guy who knows his swim moves, knows his rip moves, knows how strong he is, has experience. Because clearly, trying to develop guys like GTS hasn't gone well. Yeah, Diaby played some good football last year, but still doesn't have a lot of pass rushing moves and is having trouble breaking down the quarterback. Maybe it's time to just get a Trey Hendrickson in there and just cook. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
You had mentioned something about, I don't know who you were talking about, but the fact that if you get enough pressure, you could have really mid cornerbacks and be able to
especially in a Todd Bowles defense where Todd Bowles likes to run this cover 3. He likes to have his guys rally the ball at the point of attack, and it's a lot harder when there's no pressure, right? Because then that allows the play to develop more. You're allowing wide receivers and tight ends to get away from corners and linebackers and safeties and get separation. Then you can't rely on the ball afterwards. That's why you see a lot of these soft zone breakdowns from Todd Bowles' defense. A really good edge rush and a really good pass rush would fix a lot of those problems. So whether it's a bad thing or not, that the defense depends on that is one thing, but it would certainly fix it.
Well, we've seen it in the past in Todd Bowles' defense. Getting pressure on opposing quarterbacks has been huge for his defensive success. And it's something that we have missed over the past couple of years. And that's where I think like a guy like a Trey Hendrickson would be, you could get away with it. Like a guy of that level would be able to. But again, going back, it's going to be expensive to retain his.
Really expensive, and not just in contract, in draft capital. And we know Jason Light loves his draft capital.
Mm-hmm. So I think it'll be interesting. I think they might go with one of these other guys. You look at like a Chase Young, for instance. I think that's probably somebody that should be on their radar, a little bit of a cheaper option. And then you look at a guy like a Josh Sweat. I think he's starting to fly a little bit under the radar at this point because of all the hype around Myles Garrett and Trey Hendrickson.
That's true, and he's going to be expensive. But at some point, if you think you're a winning football team, you got to make those calls. They got to get Godwin extended. They got to get Luke Gedeke extended. They can make all this work, but they have to take care of their own guys. And Jason Light, he likes his own guys. He likes the guys he drafts. He likes to keep teams very similar. And whether or not that's a good thing, it's up for debate. But the Bucs won 10 games last year. They're going to try and win more this year, and they might do it with a very similar looking team. Yeah.
And let's move on here, because this is probably one of the more painful things I think that Buccaneers fans had to suffer through last year, and that's in the linebacker room, especially when it came to coverage linebackers. Obviously, we got how many games out of Servassier?
Not a lot. It might have. It's probably around 2
to 3, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, but in those 2 to 3 games, he was
doing well in coverage, especially on third downs. So, he's displayed the ability to make it happen, but he's got to stay healthy.
If he can with him, it's if he can stay healthy, and he's going to be a really good player if he can stay healthy. But the unknown Levante David, I think with the recent news of the Commanders and Bobby Wagner coming to a 1-year deal, you probably see Levante be like, all right, if Bobby's doing it again, I can do it. Like, I'm going to keep.
Well, sure. And I want to bring up, too, how important that is, because Bobby Wagner, as far as the money, that's the benchmark, right? So Commanders bring back Bobby Wagner on a 1-year deal, $8 million guarantee, up to $9.5 million. So that's probably about what you're looking at when it comes to Levante David. Mm-hmm. So that might be about what it costs. And that's probably more, I think, than a few people were anticipating. So that will be interesting, because I don't see Levante David necessarily wanting to play in another uniform, but if he wants to play again and the Bucs don't want to give up 9.5, well, then you're in a situation.
I think they can. come in a bit lower than that with Levante.
Yeah, a bit. Yeah,
not huge, but a bit.
right.
Maybe
Yeah. So that's
max. Like
yeah. So that's something to watch. I think if you're a Bucs fan, keep that number in your mind because that's about where it's going to land.
But
You got some options here, right? A few different people that you could try and bring back. I mean, Terrell Dodson's a name that I've heard thrown around. He was with the Seahawks, then he went to Miami. Definitely a really good tackler. Needs some help in the run game, but if you need a coverage guy, he's not bad at that point. So that's something to watch for sure. A lot of different ways you can go. Joseph Asai from Cincinnati should be pretty cheap. Hasn't done too much, but that's a high upside signing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these guys that the Bengals drafted, they tried to replace a lot of guys on defense, and it didn't intrinsically work. So some of those guys might be available.
Obvious guys off the table, Bobby Wagner, Zach Bond. That was one of the first ones to kind of fall.
And if you're the Eagles, of course, why not?
Yeah, I mean, that guy is just unbelievably good.
Yeah.
And it would have been freaking fantastic to be able to
yeah.
But that's obviously not going to happen. An interesting name, I think he's become kind of a 3-down, linebacker there. Nick Bolton, still a young guy, played in Steve Spagnuolo's defense. So
that's true.
He's an off-ball linebacker, so that's huge. Something.
Bolton's a bruiser of the run game too, so that helps there as well. He brings that aspect. If you can get some good coverage out of him, he would be pretty well rounded.
And I'm curious about this one, Dre Greenlaw.
Well, Greenlaw is the big one, right?
Yeah,
he's coming off of an Achilles injury, and that tends to be a death knell for a lot of NFL players because it just limits your ability to be explosive. And if you want to be a rangy guy like Greenlaw and get some good coverage linebacker, which, man, do the Bucs need a good coverage linebacker? You'd have to weigh that risk and think about that because when Greenlaw plays, he's been a stud. Make no mistake.
I mean, he returned in that one game. I mean, he still played like
right, and not a guy that gets the accolades, individually. But when you look at the tape and you look at how he fit into that 49ers defense, he plays really good football. So if the Bucs can be confident that they can get some good play out of him, that's one thing. But again, I would bring up injuries destroyed this team on defense last year. Do you want to keep bringing in players who have an injury history? If it makes them cheaper, that's one thing, but how much cheaper? How much cheaper is Dre Greenlaw going to be? So the idea of Dre Greenlaw is fantastic, but how that goes in sort of practice, I think that's a big one. So we'll see if Jason Light bites on that.
There's a couple options, and I don't think these guys are going to be over the top expensive. You'll probably find them middle of the pack. Obviously, Trey could command a decent amount.
Right.
I mean, you look at what Zach Bond got, $51 million, 3 years. So
that's probably not going to be as common,
right?
Yeah,
exactly. So you look at these other guys that would be very good fits in a top ball system. Guys who like to make plays, guys who can play off ball linebacker, play all 3 downs for you. You don't have to take them off the field all that much. Would be great. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. I think you have a better opportunity of getting a guy in free agency here than you might in the draft. That is in terms of coverage, but I mean, you could go either way with that.
I agree.
But with that being said, let's go to the secondary. The number 1 cornerback in free agency, according to NFL.com, is Carlton Davis III.
I don't know about that fit in a Tom Bowles defense. Probably not there because Carlton's injury history is why they get traded away from him, and he broke his jaw with Detroit, which is a diff. That's I'm not sure how you really do that in a football helmet. That's a tough, but great corner. We might see the Bucs move on from Jamel Dean for a similar reason, and the production's not there in conjunction with the injuries. So I'm not sure about a reunion with Davis in the cards, especially because he might be more expensive. because he played well. He's a good cornerback, first of all. He plays excellent football. But Todd Bowles said he wants ball hawks too, and the ability for Carlton Davis to not haul in interceptions is impressive, honestly. So I don't see that really working out in Tampa Bay again.
So, I mean, I think like after that, you're looking at guys, if, like you mentioned, Todd Bowles wants ball hawks, guys who, attack the ball,
Right.
play physical, that type of guy. You're looking at a Charvarius Ward, great player, and
Yep.
a guy who's not really talked about enough, I don't think, because he played opposite of Sauce Gardner there in New York, is DJ Reed. And then honestly, even you could look at like a Byron Murphy before you get into some of the other guys that have kind of an inconsistent
Oh,
play.
for sure. And some of those guys would be pretty expensive, but I mentioned it with edge rushers. I'll mention it here again. Eventually, you might want to just make it happen, right? So, get a big free agent, lock him in long term. For corners, those are good names. Paulson Adebo, another one. But guys like Byron Murphy have been on the Bucs radar. I'm sure you hear that a lot. Safeties are interesting too because Tyke Smith might end up playing safety.
Right.
And if that's the case, you would have to find sort of a way for someone to get in the slot, or you could have Tyke still play in the slot and then have some packages where someone else comes and plays safety while that's happening.
We still got Chris Izzy in there too. Like
for sure.
Let's not forget, like, yeah, he had a rough end to his rookie season, but he started off really hot, and even in spot play this year, he did and he played freaking everywhere, I feel like, last year.
Yeah.
So
for sure, he did.
He's a versatile guy that you can move down into the nickel slot as long as you have coverage linebackers that can kind of help him in some areas. Then it would be great. But that these two kind of go hand in hand, like you mentioned, Rivers, safeties, corners. What are the Bucs kind of doing? There's been talk about moving Tyke to the safety position because Jordan Whitehead is gone, one of those cap casualties there for the Buccaneers. Are there any safeties that you think the Buccaneers might possibly go get?
Well, there's a name that we've heard thrown around a little bit from a few different Bucs beat members, and of course, I'll give you a little sneak preview at our very own JC Allen's mock offseason coming out tomorrow. Make sure you guys watch or read that. He put a lot of effort into it, and it's good stuff. Andre Sisco from Jacksonville is a name that you've heard kind of get bounced around by a few people, because if Todd Bowles wants ball hawks, there's a guy who's historically been able to do that. He had 4 interceptions in 2023. He had 3 in 2022. Had a downturn in his play last year. Only nabbed 1 pick. So that's something to be wary of, but that also might make him cheaper. And if the Bucs think they can fix him, and that's what every team's job is when it comes to free agency at some point, you can get some good ball hawk production out of a guy like that. Allows you to be a little bit freer with Tyke Smith, and he would not be that expensive. So that's an option that you could see probably.
I'm loving with you talking about this right now. Buffon guy.
Yeah, another injury that Hufanga suffered. In fact, I believe playing against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, right? In 2023. So, but it's not inherently bad to sign someone who's been injured. I should say that it's not an inherently bad thing.
But at the end of that's the type of player, right? Like that's the type of guy you want: hard hitting, going after the ball, trying to create plays. Especially next to Antoine Winfield Jr.
And if Antoine Winfield Jr. can become his old self again, which, he had a rough year last year, if you get someone next to him, be it Tyke Smith or be it anyone else, that's going to be good news for the Buccaneers, because if Winfield's on, then immediately that secondary and that back end becomes so much more bolstered. So,
I think that contract has a little something to do with that.
We'll see. Maybe. Injuries, contract, whatever it is. Whatever it is. But thank you guys for tuning in. Real quick, River, to wind it up here, where do you think the Bucs go in free agency here? Where along, it could be even, depth piece along the offensive line. We could see probably like Robert Hainsey, backup center, depth piece, potentially leave for a starting gig, because I think he probably will.
The Jacksonville job just opened up there, so that's potential. So where do you think the Buccaneers really go to spend this free agency, for your final thoughts?
This is a good question. A top Bulls defense needs a lot of things, but I think predominantly you're looking at coverage linebackers and edge rushers. And so I think they'll pursue one of those two in free agency, and then they'll draft the other probably in the first round. There's some decent chess pieces in this draft. You got guys like Jalen Walker and Jihad Campbell who can kind of do both. And I think top Bulls is going to want someone like that. So I can see them going with one of those two if they're either available. Both are shooting up draft boards pretty highly. But either of those guys are available. You can get one of those and then maybe go for edge rusher in free agency, especially because they need an experienced guy because they've had trouble coaching them. As Low Country Pirate actually mentioned earlier, they got Larry Foote back on edge rushers coaching them. So that's might be a way that you can develop some guys further. But I think they'll go linebacker maybe in the draft. I think they'll probably go for an edge rusher. You might see a Joey Bosa, a Khalil Mack, someone of that caliber coming to Tampa Bay. So it'll be interesting to see.
It's hard to disagree with you. I think you're probably, if you're not right on, you're probably pretty dang close. I think you have to at this point.
Yeah.
It hasn't quite worked out with developing there. And what has worked in the past, you brought in Shaq Barrett, like years ago with the Super Bowl, that immediately changed that pass rush with JPP on the other side or on the same side at times too. So it is something that they need to seriously think about. And I think that they understand that. And hopefully they understand that because the Buccaneers could have won games last year if it weren't for lapses on the defensive side of the ball. So
sure.
Not much changing on the offensive side of the ball. Obviously, we talked about Chris Godwin. Obviously, some of the depth pieces along the offensive line, as long as they do bring back Ben Bredesen, which is, in my opinion, likely to happen, especially after we saw
the contract
Alex Kappa got with the Raiders. You're probably going to see something similar happen with Ben, another 2-year deal, something like that, to kind of round out that Baker Mayfield contract and maybe moving forward past it. But I think you're right. I think you go spend, if you're going to spend big, this is the time to spend big, and it's at the edge rusher position. You could probably get a mid-level corner, I think they would probably go corner in free agency over a safety.
I agree.
Just because they have guys that are versatile. You talk about Tyke, you talk about
right. They like Tyke as that chess piece. I think they're going to put him in there, and I think in the modern NFL, you need guys to move around, especially in a top Bulls defense. It's so dense as it is. So
I think you're nailing it right on the head, the River, and we appreciate all you guys tuning in. I've got my Bullets gear on, so I know a bunch of Tampa Bay fans probably tuned into that. I got on the TV behind me. I don't know what's going on. I know the second period probably has started about halfway through. But while we got you here, if you are watching on X, if you're watching on Facebook, head over to our YouTube, click subscribe. You'll get notified anytime that we are live. We're going to be doing these weekly for you guys, and then when the season gets started, we do post-game recaps as well. We're going to start bringing you guys more and more content through our YouTube channel, try and get this thing up and running and do it better than we've ever done it before for you guys. As River had mentioned before, our own JC Allen, you guys probably know JC a ton. He's been around for a while covering the Buccaneers. He's got some mocks coming out tomorrow morning, fresh out the news for you guys. So head over to BucsGameday tomorrow morning. Check that out. Head over tonight. We've got plenty of stuff over there, especially when it relates to what's going to happen in free agency with the Bucs, as well as the NFL draft coming up in a little over a month. So for myself, you can follow me at CHSNO on X. For our lead editor, River Wells, follow him at River H. Wells. This has been another episode of Hear the Cannons, guys.